On my birthday, my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just wasting space in this house." The room froze. The words didn't echo, they lodged like shards of glass in my chest. I sat with my fork halfway to my mouth, staring at her, waiting for her to laugh, to say it was a cruel joke. But her lips didn't tremble. She meant it. Every syllable was as deliberate as the slice of a knife. I turned slowly toward my son, my boy, the one I had carried on my shoulders when his legs were too tired to walk home from school, the one I stayed awake for when fevers burned through his childhood nights. I searched his eyes for protest, for even the faintest flicker of defiance against his wife's cruelty, but he lowered his gaze. He busied himself with his plate, as if the mashed potatoes were suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. Silence became his shield, and in that silence he abandoned me. The clinking of cutlery from the grandchildren pierced the stillness. Their innocent chatter continued, oblivious, like sunlight streaming through the cracks of a ruined house. To them, it was still a birthday dinner. To me, it became a funeral, the burial of my place in this family. I felt the walls around me shift. These were walls I had helped raise, rooms I had painted, floors I had walked across for decades. Yet now, with a single sentence, they no longer belonged to me. I had become a trespasser in my own home, a ghost sitting at the table, unwanted, unneeded, unloved. I wanted to speak. God, how I wanted to. I wanted to pound my fist on the table, to remind them who had kept the lights on when they were young, who had worked until his body bent under the weight of years so that they could sit here in comfort, ungrateful and secure. I wanted to say that space isn't wasted by those who built it, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by pride and sorrow. Her eyes didn't waver. She leaned back, folded her arms as if she had just won a quiet war. And perhaps she had, because it was not just her words that destroyed me, but my son's silence, his refusal to stand, to defend, to remember. Betrayal does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers across a dinner table, cloaked in silence, while the fire in the hearth burns lower, and the father feels the ground beneath him vanish. That night, I didn't taste the food. I didn't blow out the candle they had placed in a cake I didn't want. I simply sat, still, invisible, hearing her words again and again, wasting space. And I wondered, how long had they thought this? How many nights had they whispered it when I wasn't in the room? How many days had my son swallowed the truth, rather than speak it to my face? When the plates were cleared and the house grew quiet, I stayed at the table long after they had gone upstairs. My hands rested on the wood, rough and scarred like my own palms, remembering the years it took to pay for it, and I thought, not for the first time, that dignity is stolen not by enemies, but by family. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. This way, you truly help us grow this channel. And now, we continue. I walked through the hall the next morning, but the house didn't sound the same. Every footstep felt like it echoed in a place I no longer belonged to. The walls were familiar. My hands had carried the wood, painted the trim, patched the cracks when storms rattled the roof. Yet after her words, nothing felt mine anymore. The photographs on the mantel, the frames I had chosen years ago, looked back at me like strangers. Smiling faces, children at birthdays, my son's wedding, all memories that should have been anchors, but now only reminded me that the man in those pictures had been erased. I opened the cupboard for a mug of coffee, and even there her presence was carved into the silence. She had rearranged the dishes months ago, placing her favorites at the front, pushing aside the old set my wife and I had bought when we first moved in. I hadn't thought much of it then, but now I saw it for what it was. Piece by piece, I was being moved to the back, just like those cups, waiting to be discarded. I sat by the window, where I used to drink my morning coffee, where sunlight once felt warm on my shoulders, but now even the light seemed cold. It didn't matter that I had built this room with my own sweat, that my body still ached from the labor of raising beams high above my head. Her words had stripped me of ownership. The walls still stood, but they no longer sheltered me. They enclosed me like a cage. The grandchildren ran past me laughing, and for a moment I felt the spark of belonging. Their joy was untainted, their hug still free of calculation. But behind them came her shadow, reminding them to play elsewhere, to give me space, as if my presence was a burden to their games, as if my chair in the corner swallowed more air than it deserved. I watched my son move through the kitchen, and I recognized him less each day. He didn't need to say anything. His silence told me enough. He had chosen peace with her over loyalty to me. And so, the man who once cried into my chest when his heart was broken now passed me like an invisible wall, pretending not to see the weight bending my shoulders. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet, I wandered the rooms slowly, my fingers brushing along the furniture, the doors, the walls. Each one carried a story of sacrifice, of labor, of years when money was scarce but determination was abundant. I could still feel the cold of the nights I spent patching leaks alone, the heat of the summers when I mowed acre after acre to keep the yard alive. Yet now, walking through these same rooms, I felt like an intruder trespassing in a museum of my own life. Her words played on repeat in my head. "You're just wasting space." And the cruelest part was that space itself agreed with her. Chairs that used to welcome me now stood stiff, indifferent. The bed where I tried to sleep felt too large, mocking my solitude. Even the air seemed to thin around me, as though the house itself was pushing me out, siding with her judgment. A man shouldn't feel like a guest in the home he built. A father shouldn't have to measure his steps, afraid that every creak of the floorboards is a reminder to others that he is still here. Yet that was my reality now. Betrayal does not always roar. It settles quietly until even silence whispers that you are not wanted. One evening, the weight of silence became unbearable, and I found myself standing in the kitchen doorway while they spoke in low voices. I didn't mean to overhear, but the words reached me anyway, carried through the hum of the refrigerator and the clatter of dishes. She was telling him again that I had no place here, that the house was too small for 3 adults, that I was only dragging the family down. And when I heard her say I was a shadow clinging to their life, I waited for his voice, my son's voice, to rise against hers, to cut through her contempt with the truth. I waited for him to remember. But what came was worse than her insult. It was his silence. He dried his hands on a towel, nodding faintly, the way a man does when he agrees but does not dare to put the agreement into words. That simple gesture cut deeper than any sentence, because in that nod was betrayal. In that silence was surrender. And in that surrender was the end of something I thought could never break, the bond between father and son. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, heart pounding as though I had run miles. I realized in that moment that the man I had raised, the boy who once looked at me as if I were unshakable, now chose to keep peace with his wife rather than defend the man who had built the very ground under his feet. And that was the wound I could not mend, a wife's contempt I could endure. But my son's silence, that was the knife in my back. Later that night we all sat at the table again. She tossed casual remarks about space and usefulness, each one a stone thrown into my chest. I didn't even look at her. My eyes searched only for his, hoping he would break, hoping he would remember. But he chewed his food, glanced at the children, spoke about work, about weather, about anything but me. His silence was no longer just absence. It was a choice. He had decided that my dignity was not worth disturbing the peace of his dinner table. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by family and realizing you are utterly alone. It doesn't roar. It doesn't even sting in the way open insults do. It hollows you. It strips you bare. It forces you to look across the table and understand that the man you sacrificed everything for no longer sees you as a father, but as a burden. When I went upstairs that night, the house felt colder than it ever had. Every step creaked under my feet like an accusation, echoing the truth I didn't want to admit. I was being erased, not by enemies, but by my own blood. A stranger could hurt me, but my son's silence was the true betrayal. It was the moment I realized the wound wasn't temporary. It was meant to last, and no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, I knew, from that day on, I was standing alone. It began with the smallest things, so small that if I had complained, they would have laughed and said I was imagining it. But I knew. One morning, when I came to sit in my chair by the window, the chair was gone, moved to another room. In its place stood a sleek new armchair she had ordered online, too modern, too perfect, too untouched. It looked at me like a warning. This space isn't yours anymore. I stood there, staring at the empty spot where I had watched the sun rise for years, and for the first time in my own home, I didn't know where to sit. Later, I found the bookshelf I had carefully arranged, my books lined up in the order I had read them, with notes tucked inside the margins. But now the shelves had been rearranged, my old paperbacks shoved to the bottom, spines bent inward, covered by polished frames and trinkets she had chosen. The memories I had kept in ink and paper, the voices that had walked with me through long nights of labor, had been pushed aside to make room for decoration. I bent down to pick up one of the books, but my hands trembled and I set it back without opening it. Even my stories had been silenced. At dinner the boundary grew sharper. The head of the table, where I had once sat without question, now belonged to my son. I had accepted that long ago. It was natural. But even the seat beside him, my familiar place, was quietly taken. A plate was set further down, near the edge where conversation barely reached. When I sat there, I became background, a shadow nodding politely while laughter bloomed at the other end. And when I spoke, my words had to cross the distance of the table like whispers across a canyon. They rarely made it to the other side. Every day the house redrew its map, and every day I was pushed further into the margins. The tools in the garage, the ones I had used to build the deck and mend the roof, were boxed and labeled for storage. My coat, once hanging near the door, was moved to the back of a closet. Even the coffee mug I had used for years, chipped at the rim but familiar, was suddenly gone, replaced by a matching set of cups that gleamed with a uniform shine. Little by little, my life was erased, and the spaces that once carried my fingerprints now belonged to her order, her taste, her rules. I tried to tell myself it was just change, that families evolve, that new traditions grow. But inside, I knew the truth. This wasn't change, it was displacement. My presence was being compressed, reduced from a man who had built a home to a relic tucked in its corner. Dignity doesn't disappear in a single blow. It dies in inches, in quiet removals, in chairs and shelves and plates moved just far enough to remind you that you are no longer central, no longer needed, no longer wanted. And so I found myself retreating, to the porch when the house was too full of her laughter, to my room when the family gathered in the living room, to silence when words burned in my chest but had no place to land. Every day the house grew smaller for me, while for them it seemed to open wide. And I realized with a slow, bitter clarity that the life I had built was no longer mine. It was theirs, and I was only borrowing space, waiting for the moment when even that would be taken away. One night, after everyone had gone to sleep, and the house sank into that deep, echoing quiet that only comes after resentment has drained the air, I walked to the study. It was the one room she rarely entered, too plain for her taste, too filled with old wood and older memories. In the corner, under the weight of years, sat a small oak desk, scuffed at the edges, worn where my elbows had leaned through countless late nights. Its drawer stuck a little when pulled, as if it too resisted letting go of what it held. With both hands I tugged it open. Inside lay the papers, yellowed, edges curled, smelling faintly of dust and ink. They weren't just documents. They were proof of a life poured into more than bricks and wood, pages stamped with seals, contracts with signatures, foundation charters that had once been signed in hope and sweat. My name was there, written again and again, steady, careful, deliberate. Each stroke of the pen carried a fragment of the man I once was, the man who had dreamed not only of a house for his family, but of a legacy they could stand on long after I was gone. I lifted one of the documents, and the past unfolded before me. I remembered the day I had first signed it, the room too small for the ambition it carried, my hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. I had worked double shifts then, carrying on my shoulders both debt and duty, and still I had dared to put my name at the bottom of something larger than myself. I had believed, fiercely, stubbornly, that my son would one day see that signature not just as ink, but as a door I had carved open for him. Now, decades later, I held that same page in my hands, and it felt heavier than stone. Not because the paper weighed much, but because it bore the truth she could not erase. I was not a man wasting space. I was the one who had built the space. Without these signatures, these stamps, these yellowed words, there would be no table for them to laugh at, no roof under which she could dismiss me, no walls for her voice to echo against. Everything she claimed as hers had once begun in these pages, in my sweat, in my sacrifice. But I didn't keep them for revenge. I didn't imagine storming into the dining room, slamming the documents down, and demanding their gratitude. No, that was not why I had saved them all these years. I kept them because they were pieces of me, silent witnesses that no insult could erase. Proof that I had lived not in vain, that my work had mattered, that I had left a mark deeper than their dismissal. I sat for a long time with those papers spread before me, the lamplight casting shadows across the ink. And in that stillness, I felt something shift inside. Not anger, not even sorrow, but a quiet resolve. They could push me to the margins, strip me of chairs, shelves, even my place at the table, but they could never take this away. The truth was here, in my hands, etched in signatures and sealed in history. They could blind themselves to it, but it remained. I gathered the documents carefully, smoothing each page as if it were a fragile part of my body. Then I placed them back into the drawer, closed it softly, and rested my hand on the wood. For the first time in weeks, my breath steadied. I realized I didn't need to shout to reclaim dignity. Sometimes it is enough to hold the truth in silence, knowing that when the time comes, the papers will speak louder than any voice that tries to bury you. That night, I returned to my room with no audience, no applause, no understanding from those upstairs. But within me burned a flame they couldn't extinguish, the flame of quiet remembrance, of proof unshakable, of a man who would not be erased, no matter how small they tried to make him. I could not sleep that night. The papers lay heavy in my mind, their words stirring old ghosts. Closing my eyes only pulled me backward, to nights when my hands were raw, my back bent, and the house they now called theirs was nothing more than a dream on scraps of paper. I remembered laying the first brick, the way the dust clung to my skin, mixing with sweat until it stung my eyes. There had been no applause then, no comfort, only the sound of my own breathing, steady and stubborn in the dark. I saw myself in the cold winters, sitting by a single lamp, sketching plans on the kitchen table, long after everyone else had gone to bed. My wife would sometimes wake and tell me to rest, but I couldn't. Rest was for those who had already arrived. I was still building a road out of nothing. Each number I wrote, each line I drew, carried the weight of our future. And though no one remembers now, those nights carved the foundation on which this family still walks. I recalled the summers when I worked 2 jobs, my clothes stiff with dirt and sweat, while others slept in comfort. I hauled timber, mixed cement, negotiated with men who laughed at my small beginnings. I gave them everything I had, strength, hours, even my health. And for what? So that years later, I could sit in this house and be told I was wasting space. The irony burned deeper than fire, yet I also remembered the small victories. The first loan approval after weeks of rejection. The day I hammered the last nail into the frame of the porch. The moment I carried my son, still a child, into the finished room and told him, "This is yours now." He never knew how much it cost me to say those words. He only saw walls, floors, a roof. He did not see the nights without sleep, the meals skipped, the bones that ached. He could not see what it took for me to give him a world already half built when he grew into it. No one saw. That was the truth. They saw the house rise, the family business grow, the comfort take root. But they did not see the man who traded years of his life for every inch of progress. They lived in the light while I toiled in the shadows, and maybe that was always the way it was meant to be. Fathers are not built for recognition. They are built to carry weight until others no longer notice the burden at all. But as I sat there, memories swirling like ashes in the wind, I realized something painful. Perhaps it was my own fault they could look at me now and see only an old man taking up room. I had hidden the struggle so well, concealed the scars, made it seem easy, because I didn't want them to feel the fear I carried every day. In protecting them from the cost, I erased myself from the story. They grew up thinking the ground beneath them was steady from the start, never knowing how often it almost collapsed. Still the truth remained, whether they saw it or not. The beams above their heads, the walls around their laughter, the name on the foundation, all of it was held together by the years I cannot take back. Invisible work, invisible sacrifice. And even if they refuse to remember, even if she dares to call me wasted space, these walls know. These bricks remember. Every scar on my body is carved into them. I sat in the dark until dawn touched the horizon, and for a moment I let myself believe the house breathed with me, that it knew I was its maker. They could try to erase me, but nothing could strip away the truth that their world was raised on my invisible labor. Without me, there would have been nothing, and without that knowledge, I would have been nothing. The next weeks became a slow procession of glances, sharp, deliberate, and colder than any words she could have spoken. It was no longer the direct insult over dinner. It was something quieter, more corrosive. Every time I entered a room, her eyes cut through me with that look a person gives to clutter left too long in the corner. Not hatred, worse, indifference, as if I were an object taking up air, a weight that had to be endured. At breakfast, she set plates for everyone else before mine, her hands moving with practiced grace, yet always leaving me last. The gesture was small, almost invisible to someone not looking for it, but I felt it each time like a needle under the skin. When she spoke, her words were coated in courtesy sharp enough to wound, remarks about needing more room, about keeping things organized, about making space for the children. None of it addressed me directly, yet every syllable struck where it was meant to strike. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. Dismissal, when repeated enough, becomes a language all its own. I began to notice the rhythm of her contempt. When I coughed, she sighed. When I lingered too long in the kitchen, she found a reason to move past me, brushing close enough to remind me I was in her way. When I spoke, she nodded politely, but her eyes slid elsewhere before I even finished. That look, that quiet refusal to see me, was the cruelest part. To be treated not as an adversary, but as absence, as someone not worth acknowledging, erased me more thoroughly than shouting ever could. My son noticed, I know he did. His shoulders tensed each time she did it, but he said nothing, and his silence made her gaze bolder, as though his lack of protest was permission to continue. With every unspoken defense, he handed me over to her verdict. I was not father, not elder, not even man. I was a burden to be tolerated until time itself carried me out of their house. Even the children began to mirror her tone, though they did not understand it. They grew quieter when I entered the room, glancing at their mother for approval before daring to sit on my lap or tug at my sleeve. Love, once natural, became cautious. I felt it slipping away, piece by piece, the way rope frays under constant strain. Not because they stopped caring, but because they learned from her eyes how to see me. Unnecessary, outdated, unimportant. I would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, replaying those looks in my mind. A younger man might have argued, shouted, demanded respect. But I knew words against her would only strengthen her claim, that I was disruptive, taking up too much space, making life harder. So I swallowed it in silence, carrying each cold glance like a stone in my chest. Dignity does not shatter in one blow. It crumbles under the steady pressure of eyes that see you as nothing. There were moments when I caught myself reaching for proof, those papers locked in the drawer, the memories etched in my hands, wanting to throw them on the table and force her to look, but I didn't, not yet, because I understood something she did not. The truth does not need to shout. It waits. And though her gaze stripped me day after day, I held on to the quiet certainty that one day, When the time came, the silence she wielded against me would be broken, not by my anger, but by reality itself. Until then, I endured her cold eyes, each one another reminder that to her I was no one. And yet, beneath her dismissal, I felt the ember of a truth she could never bury. I had been someone long before she came, and I would remain someone long after her gaze turned away. It happened on a night that should have been ordinary, but ordinary no longer existed in that house. The children were running through the hallway, their laughter rising and falling like bells, when her voice cut through it, sharp and deliberate. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, arms folded, and with a coldness she didn't bother to hide, she said it again. "You are wasting our space. You are wasting our time." The words struck with the same force as the first time I had heard them, but now they carried a cruel rhythm, practiced and familiar. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, almost casual, as if she were speaking a fact everyone already knew. My son stood beside her, his face pale, his mouth tight, but still he said nothing. That silence, heavier than any insult, filled the room until it pressed against my ribs like a weight. The children froze, their laughter cut short, eyes wide. They didn't understand the words, not fully, but they understood the tone. They turned their faces toward me, searching for a reaction, waiting for me to argue, to fight back. But I didn't. For the first time, I felt no anger rising to meet her cruelty. Only weariness. Only the deep, suffocating knowledge that nothing I said would matter. Words against her had become stones thrown into a river, vanishing, swallowed, leaving no trace. I felt my hands clench at my sides, trembling not from rage but from restraint. To speak would have been to beg, and I would not beg in the house I had built. To shout would have been to confirm her accusation, to show her that I was disruptive, consuming more space with my voice than she was willing to grant me. So I did the only thing left. I turned without a word and walked away. Up the stairs, past the framed photographs that no longer looked like family, down the hallway that felt narrower each day, I moved like a man carrying a coffin on his back. My steps were steady, deliberate, though my heart pounded in my chest like a drum. I entered my room, shut the door, and went to the small chest in the corner. From beneath folded clothes and forgotten belongings, I pulled out the key, cold, heavy, unyielding. It pressed into my palm like a reminder of everything I had held back. It was the key to the old safe, hidden where no one else thought to look. Inside lay the papers, the contracts, the foundation documents that bore my name. Proof that the house she claimed as hers, the life she stood upon so confidently, had been carved from my labor. I held the key tightly, the metal biting into my skin, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not victory, not revenge, something quieter, a certainty that while her words could strip me of place, they could not erase the truth. Downstairs, her voice carried on, sharp and dismissive, as if her declaration had settled everything. But in my hand, the key reminded me that the ground beneath her certainty was not hers at all. It was mine. And though I did not storm down to confront her, though I did not raise my voice, though I gave her no satisfaction of a fight, I knew that one day these papers would speak louder than her contempt. That night, I did not sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, the key still in my hand, listening to the muffled sounds of the house that no longer welcomed me. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel erased. The proof waited, silent and patient, locked away. And I realized that sometimes justice does not roar. It waits for the right moment to step into the light. Until then, I would endure, not because I was weak, but because I carried something stronger than their dismissal. I carried the truth, sealed in steel and paper, heavier than any words she could throw at me. I waited until the house was asleep, every door closed, every light extinguished, the silence broken only by the ticking of the old clock in the hall. That was when I finally took the key and walked to the safe. It was hidden in plain sight, behind a cabinet no one ever touched, buried under years of dust. My hands knew its weight before I even touched it, because I had carried that weight for decades. The metal creaked as I turned the key, a sound like bones shifting after too long in the dark. Inside lay no gold, no jewelry, no treasures anyone else would care about. Only paper. Stacks of it, carefully bound, edges yellowing, corners frayed. To anyone else it would have looked unremarkable, but to me, it was the very marrow of my life. I pulled the first file free and opened it under the dim lamplight. The letters swam before my eyes, not from age, but from memory rushing back so fast it blurred my vision. There it was, the charter of the foundation. The ink of my name, bold and steady, written before my son was even grown, before she had ever entered this house, before the laughter of children filled these walls. My name stood first. Mine, not his, not hers. Mine. Without that signature, there would be no business, no house, no security for them to stand upon. The foundation of their comfort had been poured by my own hands, signed with my own sacrifice. Every other name on the page followed mine like a shadow follows light. I turned to the next document and the next. Contracts signed when money was scarce, when lenders turned me away until I forced them to look again. Receipts for materials bought with wages that could have gone to food or rest, but instead went into the skeleton of a dream I was building for them. Every page was a silent witness. Every signature was a piece of my body and soul carved into history. I remembered the day I placed those documents here. I was younger then, but already tired, already worn. I told myself that if the world ever forgot, if even my family turned blind to what had been built, these papers would remain. Proof that I had been more than just a man moving through years. Proof that I had created something lasting, something that would stand even when I could not. And now, here I was, decades later, standing over them like a man standing over his own grave, realizing that the legacy I had secured was invisible to the very people who lived inside it. My son thought of me as a burden, his wife as wasted space. They could walk through this house every day and never know that every nail, every beam, every coin that funded its foundation carried my fingerprint. They lived inside the story, but I was the author they refused to read. I placed my hand on the stack of papers, fingers trembling. In that touch, I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride, because no matter what they said, the truth was here, undeniable. Sorrow, because I had saved all this, not to prove myself to strangers, but to be remembered by my own. And still here I was, unseen in the home I had built. I closed the safe with the same care as if I were tucking a child into bed. The key turned with a heavy finality, and I pressed it against my palm until the edges dug into my skin. I carried it back to my room, not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as a reminder. They could strip me of place, of comfort, of respect at their table. But they could not erase these pages. They could not erase the truth. Without me, there would have been nothing. Without me, there would be no house, no business, no laughter of children echoing in halls that only stood because I made them stand. That night, as I lay awake with the key under my pillow, I understood something. Justice does not always arrive in shouts or sudden victories. Sometimes it waits, patient, locked in paper and steel, until the day it is forced into the light. And when that day came, no one, not even she, would be able to deny what my hands had built and my name had begun. It happened on a day when I was not at home. I had gone for a long walk, the kind of walk that keeps a man from drowning in the silence of his own thoughts. I left the house quiet, leaving the key tucked back into its hiding place, certain no one would notice or care. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. She had been searching for something mundane, a bill, a receipt, a paper she thought I had misplaced. Annoyance drove her hands, that same impatience that always surfaced when she thought of me as disorganized, cluttered, in the way. She pulled open drawers she had no reason to touch, moved aside old clothes, small boxes, until her fingers closed around the cool weight of the key. She held it without knowing, curious, suspicious, the way one does when they discover something they were never meant to hold. The safe had always been just a piece of furniture to her, another relic of a man she believed time had already erased. But with the key, it whispered possibilities. And so she turned it, metal grinding against metal, the sound heavy in the quiet room. The door opened with a sigh, and for the first time in decades, the truth lay bare to someone other than me. She expected old papers of no consequence, perhaps bills, perhaps memories. What she found instead was the marrow of the family's existence. Her eyes fell on the first document, the charter of the foundation, and there, bold and undeniable, was my name at the top. Not a footnote, not an afterthought. The first name, the cornerstone, written before hers, had ever been tied to this family, before even my son had carried weight in its making. She read it once, then again, her lips moving silently as though repetition could alter what was written. But ink does not bend to contempt, it only tells the truth. Page after page, her certainty began to fracture. Contracts that bore my signature before any other. Agreements sealed, because I had convinced men to take risks they otherwise would not. Proof of sacrifices she had never seen, nights she had never known, labor she had never imagined. Every sheet of paper contradicted the lie she had carried in her voice, the lie she had flung at me again and again, that I was useless, wasting space, nothing but a burden. Here, in her hands, was the undeniable evidence that I was the very reason she had space to waste at all. I was not there to see her face, but I can imagine it. The stiffening of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, the way her hands might have trembled slightly as the weight of those pages pressed into her. She had spent years dismissing me, cutting me down with words sharper than blades, and now she was confronted with the one thing she could not argue with. History, my name written in black ink, permanent first. Perhaps she closed the safe quickly, as if afraid of being caught in the act. Perhaps she lingered, staring at the documents as if they might burn her fingers. Either way, she could not erase what she had seen. And for the first time, the truth I had kept locked away had spoken for me, not through raised voices, not through arguments lost at the dinner table, but through the quiet authority of paper and ink. When I returned that evening, the house carried a different kind of silence. Not the dismissive silence I had grown used to, but something heavier, unsettled. She glanced at me when I walked through the door, her eyes colder than ever, but now they carried something else too, hesitation. For in that brief discovery, she had seen that I was not what she claimed. I was not a shadow in their home. I was the foundation beneath it. Without me, nothing she touched, nothing she stood upon, nothing she claimed would even exist. That night, as I lay down, I felt the key beneath my pillow once more. And though she would never speak of it, though she would bury the knowledge as deep as she could, I knew she had seen it. And once a person sees the truth, they cannot unsee it. Her words could still be cruel, her eyes still sharp, but they would never again carry the same certainty, because now she knew. I was not wasting space. I was the one who had built it. She no longer looked at me the same way after that day. The cold glances remained, but the certainty behind them had cracked. Once her eyes had carried the arrogance of a victor, a woman who believed she had conquered the house and everyone in it, even me. But now when they met mine, I saw something else. Hesitation, unease, the shadow of a truth she could not unsee. She had opened the safe, and in doing so she had opened the ground beneath her own feet. For in those papers lay a reality she could never rewrite. Her voice could strip me of a chair at the table, could push me to the edge of conversations, could paint me as useless before my son and grandchildren. But no voice, no argument, no contempt could erase the ink of those signatures. My name stood on every document like a monument carved in stone, immovable, unyielding. I was not an addition to their story. I was the beginning of it. I could feel her wrestling with it in the quiet moments. When she handed me a plate, her fingers stiff, as though the weight of the porcelain reminded her of the weight of the truth she carried now. When she walked past the study, her eyes flicking briefly to the closed drawer where the key had once been, as if the memory of what she had seen still pressed on her chest. She tried to cover it with sharper words, with sharper looks, but arrogance once broken never heals the same way. And in her tone, in her silence, I could hear it, the tremor of someone who knows their weapon no longer cuts as deeply as it once did. Every insult she had thrown at me began to unravel in her own mind. She had called me a burden, but the foundation said otherwise. She had said I was wasting space, but those papers proved the space was mine to give. She had accused me of clinging to a house that was no longer mine. Yet each contract showed I had built it before she even carried my family's name. Her confidence had been forged in the belief that I was powerless. Now she knew the truth, that her comfort, her security, her entire place in this family stood on ground I had carved with my hands, with my sacrifices, with my very life. I didn't need to expose her, didn't need to parade the documents before everyone. That was the beauty of it. She already knew. And knowledge is a heavier punishment than shame spoken aloud. Every time she looked at me now, she saw not the old man she had tried to erase, but the undeniable fact that her entire life was built on the back of the man she dismissed. At dinner, she still spoke with her cutting tone, but her eyes betrayed her. They flickered downward, faltered, as if she could feel the signatures staring back at her from the safe. My son didn't notice. He never noticed, but I did. And though I remained silent, I carried a quiet dignity that grew heavier each day. She could mock, she could sigh, she could pretend, but her certainty was gone. Her arrogance had been a shield, and I had never needed to touch it. The truth itself had shattered it. And now, though she would never admit it aloud, she lived with the knowledge that she could never erase me. Not from this house, not from this family, not from the very ground beneath her feet. In that knowledge, I found something I had been denied for so long. A measure of justice. Not the kind won in courts or arguments, but the kind that settles quietly in the soul, when you know the truth has spoken louder than every lie. And though she would never bow her head, never soften her tongue, she carried that truth with her like a weight she could never put down. It was inevitable that the papers would no longer stay hidden between her and me. Secrets have a way of surfacing, not because they are spoken aloud, but because their weight becomes too heavy to carry in silence. One evening, when the children were asleep, and the house was cloaked in the soft hum of lamps, I heard the shuffle of drawers, the hesitant voices drifting through the walls. She had gone back to the safe, not out of curiosity this time, but out of fear. And she did not go alone. My son was with her. I did not move from my chair in the hallway. I listened. The metallic scrape of the lock, the whisper of paper pulled from its resting place, the rustle of pages spread across the table, and then the silence that follows when eyes meet words they cannot deny. I could almost see his face, the way his eyes must have widened when he traced his hand over those signatures. His father's name, written again and again, standing not as an afterthought, but as the very beginning of everything. For years, he had lived under the illusion that what surrounded him was the natural course of life, that houses rise because they are meant to, that businesses grow because time pushes them forward. He had lived with the comfort of believing the ground beneath him had always been steady. But now, reading those documents, he would see what I had hidden all his life, that nothing was steady, that everything he leaned on, everything he called his own, had been carved from struggle he never saw, from battles I fought when he was too young to understand. I imagined the silence stretching between them, heavy and suffocating, her arrogance shattered, his certainty collapsing. He could no longer tell himself I was simply a man lingering in the corners of his house, taking up air. No, he now held proof in his hands that I was the cornerstone. Without me, there would be no home, no business, no legacy for his children to inherit. I was not the shadow he had allowed her to paint me as. I was the root, the shield, the reason he even stood where he did. Perhaps he tried to deny it at first, fumbling with excuses, telling himself the past does not matter now, that the papers were old, that time had changed things. But truth does not weaken with age. It grows heavier. Every page he touched was a reminder that the man he had silenced at his table had once carried him, not just as a child in his arms, but as a future on his back. And there was no defense against that. When they finally closed the safe, when the papers were locked away again, the air in the house was different. I felt it before I saw it. My son's eyes, when they met mine at breakfast the next morning, were not the same. They carried something heavier. Guilt, recognition, perhaps even shame. He didn't speak, not yet, but silence had changed its shape. It was no longer the silence of betrayal, but the silence of a man who had finally seen. I didn't need his words. For the first time in years, I didn't ache for them, because now, whether he admitted it aloud or not, he knew. He knew that the father he had allowed to be treated as a burden was the very man who had built the weight he now carried on his shoulders. He knew that I was not wasting space. I was the reason there was space at all. And as I sat across from him, my hands folded, my eyes steady, I felt the quietest form of justice settle in the room. Not loud, not triumphant, but deep, undeniable, and final. I remember the night I returned to the study after they had both seen what lay hidden in the safe. The air in the house felt heavier, quieter, like the silence that follows a storm. I opened the drawer again, pulled the documents into the soft glow of the lamp, and spread them out in front of me. The paper whispered as it unfolded, the same fragile sound I had heard years ago when I first signed them. My name was there, steady, written in ink that had outlived my strength, outlived my youth, and now outlived the lies spoken about me. I traced the lines with my finger, not to remind myself, I didn't need reminding, but to honor the truth that had carried me this far. I thought of every insult, every dismissive glance, every night at the dinner table where I had swallowed my words like stones. None of it mattered now, because here, on these pages, was the reality no one could erase. She could sigh, she could sneer, she could cast her cold eyes across the room as if I were nothing. But this ink was louder than her voice. My son could look away, could choose silence over defense, but this paper spoke where he would not. I gathered them slowly, carefully, as though each document was a living thing. I placed them back in their bundle, smoothed the edges, and lowered them into the safe. The sound of the door closing was like the closing of a chapter, a seal pressed against time. When I turned the key, I did not feel like a man hiding evidence. I felt like a man honoring truth. Justice was not in shouting, not in forcing them to admit their blindness. It was here, in this quiet act of preservation. Then, I sat back in the chair, letting the lamplight fall across my face. I didn't feel the need to stand taller, or to raise my voice, or to demand respect from those who had forgotten me. My strength was not in the fight. My strength was in the silence. Because silence, when it holds truth, is unbreakable. They could argue with me. They could diminish me. They could even pretend I was invisible. But they could never erase the words on those pages. And one day, when they are gone and their children are grown, those signatures will remain, telling the story in a voice stronger than mine could ever be. For the first time in years, I felt no urgency to defend myself. I did not imagine walking into the dining room and laying the papers before them as proof. I did not hunger for their apologies. All I felt was calm. The truth needed no stage, no witness, no applause. It simply existed, solid, undeniable, untouchable, and that was enough. I leaned back and closed my eyes, hearing the faint creaks of the old house, the same house they tried to claim as theirs alone. But the walls knew. The floorboards remembered. The beams overhead still carried the echoes of my hammer, my sweat, my breath. And the safe, closed now, carried the rest. My justice was not in the recognition they denied me. It was in the permanence of what they could never destroy. That night, I slept without bitterness. Not because they had changed, not because they had repented, but because I no longer needed them to. My dignity was not in their words. It was in the truth I carried, the truth I had locked away, the truth that would outlast them all. The change was not sudden, not dramatic, but I felt it like a shift in the air. She no longer spoke with the same edge, no longer let her voice cut so freely through the rooms. The sharpness dulled, replaced by pauses, hesitations she could not hide. Every word she directed at me now carried a shadow behind it, the weight of something she had seen but wished she could forget. She had opened the safe, read the papers, and learned the truth. And once truth touches the eyes, it cannot be unseen. At the table where she once spoke over me, she now measured her tone. Her laughter, once loud and careless, became thinner when I sat near. Even her steps softened, her presence in the house less certain. as if the ground beneath her feet had turned fragile. It was not my doing. It was not vengeance or confrontation. It was the quiet authority of reality pressing against her every movement. She had mocked me as a burden, dismissed me as wasted space. But now she lived with the knowledge that I was not a guest in this house. I was its giver, not an intruder in their lives, but the root from which their lives had grown. I did not flaunt it. I never so much as mentioned the documents. I did not need to. She carried them in her own silence, in her quick glances, in the way her words faltered when she addressed me. She had seen my name. First, undeniable, written before her story had even begun, and it followed her like a shadow. Every time she set a plate before me, her hands shook slightly, betraying the fear she tried to bury. Every time she looked into the eyes of her children, she must have remembered that the legacy they stood upon was not hers to give, nor her husband's. It had come from me. And my son, he felt it too. His silence was no longer the silence of betrayal, but of reckoning. He had walked through the same papers, traced the same ink, and seen what she had seen. His father was not a man clinging uselessly to the past, but the very architect of his present. He avoided my eyes, perhaps ashamed, perhaps unwilling to face the depth of what he had allowed to happen. But even his avoidance spoke louder than words. He knew. She knew. And knowing was enough. The house itself seemed to shift. Where once I had felt pressed into the corners, now the walls seemed to lean back toward me, as though remembering who had raised them. The rooms I had built no longer felt like cages, but like quiet witnesses standing with me in silence. The photographs on the walls, the bricks in the fireplace, the beams overhead, all of them bore my labor, and she knew it now, every time she walked through the door. She could call me old, she could call me weak, but she could never again call me nothing. Power had changed hands, though nothing was said, though no lines were drawn. It was not a victory won by shouting, but by truth standing firm against lies. She still sat at the head of conversations, still smiled for guests, still carried herself as though she ruled the home. But beneath it all, I could see it in her eyes, the knowledge that her reign was hollow. Because real power does not come from loudness or control. Real power comes from being the beginning, the root, the name that cannot be erased. And that power was mine. I no longer needed to fight for place at the table. The table was mine long before she sat at it. I no longer needed to prove myself in arguments. The proof lived in the walls, in the safe, in the history of every sacrifice I had made. She had thought she could shrink me to a shadow, but instead she had uncovered the truth that towered over her. And now, even in her silence, even in her caution, she lived beneath it. I sat in my chair that evening, quiet, steady, watching the family around me. They moved as they always had, but something invisible had changed. She lowered her voice when she spoke. My son shifted uncomfortably when I entered the room. The children still laughed, still played, but now, when they ran to me, she did not pull them away so quickly. And I knew. Dignity had returned to its rightful place. Not because I demanded it, but because the truth had demanded it for me. The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after years of storms. The sun was sinking low, painting the horizon in bruised shades of gold and purple, and I sat on the old wooden chair of the veranda. The boards creaked under my weight, the same boards I had nailed into place decades ago, with blistered hands and a vision no one else could see. The air was cooler here, freer. Away from the walls that had held so many sharp words, I could breathe without feeling their weight pressing against my chest. I heard footsteps behind me, not hurried, not heavy, but measured, uncertain. My son emerged from the doorway, carrying a steaming cup of tea. He placed it gently on the small table beside me. For a long time he didn't speak. His face was quieter now, stripped of the casual indifference that had once cut me deeper than his wife's words. He lingered there for a moment, looking at me, searching perhaps for forgiveness in the silence between us. I didn't give him words. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence carries more truth than speech ever could. He left the cup, nodded faintly, and walked back inside. She followed not long after, though she did not step onto the veranda. She stood in the doorway, her hands folded tightly, her lips pressed into a line. For the first time since she had come into this house, she did not speak. No cutting remarks, no casual dismissal, just silence. A silence that admitted what she could never bring herself to say aloud, that she knew now who I truly was. Her confidence, once a fortress, had collapsed under the weight of reality, and in that silence I felt the quiet victory of truth, rising higher than all her words had ever tried to climb. I lifted the tea, warm against my hands, and let the steam brush against my face. I thought of the years behind me, every night spent drafting plans under dim light, every calloused hand that had laid brick after brick, every sacrifice made in shadows so that others could live in light. They had forgotten. They had tried to erase. But truth is patient. It waits until it is seen, and once it rises, no one can force it back into the dark. I didn't need her apology. I didn't need his explanations. The documents lay safe, locked away, ready to speak long after my voice was gone. But even more than the papers, the walls themselves spoke for me, the beams, the foundation, the roof overhead. Every corner of that house bore my labor, and though they had tried to make me feel like a burden, the house itself remembered. And now, so did they. The grandchildren's laughter floated from inside, pure and untouched by all this quiet war. They ran through halls I had built, under ceilings I had raised, on floors I had paid for with my sweat. And one day, when they were older, when the truth became theirs to uncover, they would learn. They would see the name that stood at the beginning of it all. They would understand that their grandfather had not wasted space. He had created it. I leaned back in my chair, sipping the tea, watching the last of the sun slip beneath the trees. Dignity does not always return with fanfare. Justice does not always roar in courtrooms or in shouted arguments. Sometimes it arrives like this, in the hush of an evening, in the silence of a woman who cannot meet your eyes, in the small gesture of a son placing tea at your side without speaking. Sometimes it comes not as triumph, but as truth finally allowed to stand unchallenged. And as the crickets began to sing and the shadows grew long across the grass, I knew one thing with certainty. Never again could they call me wasted space. Never again could they reduce me to absence. For the truth had risen, quiet but undeniable, and it would outlive all their words. I was not forgotten. I was not erased. I was the root, the shield, the foundation. And in that quiet evening light I felt what I had been denied for too long. Not revenge, not recognition, but something deeper. Dignity at last restored.